Hey everyone, welcome to the Graceologie with Gwen Smith podcast. I'm Gwen Smith and I'm super glad you've joined me today. Around here we have fun, faith-focused, grace-filled conversations, all to help you know and trust God more. Our discussions are honest, often humorous, and always practical, and they're going to encourage you in meaningful ways to live out and lean on the grace of Jesus in the midst of cluttered, messy days. You got any of those? I know I do, and I can't wait to get to today's conversation, which is all about learning how to communicate with our children about Jesus and why it's so important. My guest is Natasha Crain. Natasha is a national speaker, author, and blogger who's passionate about equipping Christian parents to raise their kids with an understanding of how to make a case for and defend their faith in an increasingly secular world. She's got an MBA from UCLA and studied Christian apologetics at Biola, but Natasha's greatest reward in life comes from knowing Jesus and from spending time with her husband and 3 children. Today, she shares the heart behind her latest book, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. You and I both know the world will challenge the faith of our children, especially when it comes to Jesus. The decline of Christianity is continuing at an alarming pace, guys. Many people, even Christians, don't know what they believe, let alone why they believe it, and our children are among those. So what do we do about it? By studying apologetics, Natasha has identified several hugely important conversations we need to be having with our kids, given the specific challenges they'll encounter. In fact, this is so important. I want you to open up your podcast app right now before we even head into the conversation to share this episode with any young moms or any moms of school-aged children that you know. This is a big deal, guys. And whether you have young kids, teens, adult kids, grandkids, or you get to influence kids, this episode will better equip you for many of the challenges of discipleship today. Hey guys, before we jump into the episode, I want to hit you with a personal challenge. We talk a lot around here about studying the Bible, and here's why. Everything about your relationship with God grows stronger when you're intentional to get to know Him more by studying His Word. It informs your emotions, increases your courage, decreases your doubt, and bolsters your believing. All amazing things, right? It helps you move forward in faith and experience the power, perspective, and peace God provides. So I'm inviting you to download a free 5-day Psalm Challenge that's going to guide you on an exciting journey with the Lord. Go to psalmchallenge.com, that's psalmchallenge.com, and take the free 5-day Psalm Challenge. I promise you these 5 days of focused study will bless you so much. And now let's head into the episode. Well, hello, Natasha. Welcome to the Graceologie podcast. I'm so excited that you've joined me today.
Hi, Gwen. It's so great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Around here, we always start off our show with a fast, fun favorites round so that we can get to know you in a girlfriendy kind of way. So are you ready?
I hope I am. We'll go for it. All right.
You can do this. Okay, here we go, Natasha. Introvert or extrovert?
Oh, introvert extreme.
Okay. What is your favorite candy?
Reese's peanut butter bars or cups. Any kind of Reese's peanut butter form.
It's the best. Okay. What is your go-to skincare item?
Oh, my goodness. I'm horrible about skincare. Maybe just a basic lotion. I'm not a girly girl, so that's hard to answer for me.
That's okay. What's your favorite lotion?
You know, I don't even know what it's called. It's just a little bottle that I always order, like Amazon subscription. I know, it's not so bad.
No, you can send me a link and I'll put it on the show notes. How's that?
All right.
Perfect. All right, Natasha, what emoji do you use the most?
Probably the ha-ha, because I usually don't care enough to actually engage with a lot of the stuff on Facebook. And so when something's funny, that's what will get me to actually do something.
Okay, that's fair enough. All right, Natasha, what was your first record or CD that you ever bought?
Probably Debbie Gibson. eighth grade Debbie Gibson. Electric Youth.
Oh, that's hilarious. I love it.
I love how I said probably as if I didn't know. That really was it. I just didn't want to admit
I love it. Okay, what surprises people most about you?
Probably that I am such an introvert because I do a fair amount of speaking events. And I guess that it seems to other people like I'm really comfortable when I get up on stage, but I'm totally not. It makes me want to throw up just about every time I do it. So I think people are surprised when they hear that, because I think if you're up there speaking that you must just love it and, have no trouble with it. It's not true at all.
Got it. No, that's cool. On a scale of 1 to 10, Natasha, how good is your driving?
It depends if you ask me or my husband. My husband would say I'm a horrible driver. I would say that I'm decent, and my kids would say I don't really stop at stop signs, and it bothers them. So when they complain about it, I will stop and really pause for like 25 seconds just to make a point, and then they say, "Okay, keep going."
Okay, so what's your number? 1 to 10. How good are you?
I'd say a 5, and my husband would give me a 1.
All right. And your final question, Natasha, is if you could invite any living person to be your dinner guest, who would you invite?
Oh, my goodness. That is so hard. Maybe Ravi Zacharias. He's an apologist, and he just has this. It would be a toss up between him and John Lennox. They're two of my favorite apologists, and they're just so wise and just have so much insight about the Lord. And I've grown so much just in listening to them and reading what they've written. And so, yeah, I think they're both amazing.
I do too, but Ravi Zacharias is like one of our family favorites. I'm like so giddy going, he would be a great dinner guest. And right now he is really battling for his life. So we're just in prayer for him constantly, but I love him. So that's such a great answer. And that was a fun, fast, fun favorites round.
Yay.
All right. So now that we've had a little fun and gotten to know you in a girlfriendy kind of way, can you go ahead and formally introduce yourself to my Graceologie community?
Sure. Well, my name is Natasha, and I've been married for 20 years to my husband. We have 3 kids. We have 11-year-old twins. They're a boy and a girl. They're in 5th grade right now, finishing up 5th grade. And we have a 9-year-old daughter, and she's finishing up 3rd grade. We live in Southern California, and we have been in a private Christian school for the last several years, but we've made the big decision that this fall, and we decided this before the coronavirus, but we decided that we're going to start homeschooling. So that is kind of the big thing that's going on in our lives right now, is just anticipating that change and getting ready for it.
Wow.
And remembering that that's not going to be the same as this whole crisis schooling situation, as some people have called it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a little bit about our family. And in terms of ministry, I write and I speak about apologetics specifically for parents. So for those who might not be familiar with that too much, apologetics just means how we make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity. So how do we know Christianity is true? And there are lots and lots of great apologists and apologetic works out there to explain the evidence for the Christian faith, but I saw a need for this specifically in the area of parenting, to just kind of take all the information that's out there and then put it into a format that's really easy to understand for parents, and so that they can then equip their kids with this knowledge in a really challenging secular world that we're in. So that's kind of what I do. I do that through my blog, writing there, and then also I have written 3 apologetics books for parents.
I love it. So you're definitely spot on. There is such a need for resources to help us to really distill, if you will, all of the truth of the word in such a way that it's manageable to understand, and then to come alongside of all of the young people around us, and just for even our own hearts, to bring clarity on the truth of who Jesus is and being able to understand how to defend our faith. It's amazing. I'm super excited about where God has you in ministry. And I am excited to absolutely. I'm excited to talk about this new book that you wrote, which is Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, 30 Conversations Every Parent Must Have. So this is awesome, okay, because it is so complicated to navigate the waters of all that is coming at us. There's so many voices and so many arguments. So first of all, apologetics. What got you interested in apologetics? How did you even start down this path?
Well, this was a really interesting thing that happened to me because I never set out to be a writer or one of those uncomfortable speakers like I was talking about earlier. God has had me on an interesting journey. I was raised in a Christian home as a Christian my whole life, never walked away or anything like that, and spent hundreds and hundreds of hours in church. But about 10 years ago, I started a blog on Christian parenting. My kids were 3 and under at the time, and I just thought that, this would be a great way that I could write a little Christian parenting blog. Lots of people were starting blogs at the time. I could meet others who were interested in the same topic of how we raise our kids to know and love the Lord. And so I started this blog called Christian Mom Thoughts. And after I started writing for a while, my audience started growing and people started sharing my blog posts. But it was kind of a shock to me that I started getting a lot of people who would find my blog posts through these shares who weren't Christians, and they were coming and challenging everything that I was saying. And I wasn't looking to have these discussions. I had been a Christian my whole life, but honestly, I would have had no idea really how to answer what they were saying. But they were telling me things like, there's no evidence that Jesus existed as a person in history. There's no evidence that God exists. Science has disproved God. The Bible's filled with errors and contradictions, and just piling on and piling on. And I realized I don't know how to answer these things. And it didn't really shake my faith so much as it made me realize, wow, there's a lot that's going on in the world today that no one's prepared me for in church, and that I wasn't encountering just on my own as a parent, but my kids are going to be encountering this. And so I really started to just go looking for answers to some of these questions to know how to respond. And in the process, that's how I discovered apologetics. When I started looking for answers, I came across this term and learned what it meant and saw that there's this whole area of study, basically, where you can really learn the evidence for the truth of Christianity. And I was amazed by how much God has given us so that we can pursue that truth. And it's not just a matter of blind faith where we kind of close our eyes and jump off the cliff and say, no, I'm just going to believe in God because I want to. There's really good reason to.
Yes.
And so it was kind of this internal revolution for me. And I became passionate about this subject and realizing just how important it should be for every Christian. And so I turned my blog into a place where then I started writing about these subjects for parents and saying, hey, this is the kind of stuff that people are saying today about Christians and about Christianity and the types of truth claims that they're making. Here's what our kids need to know. And here's how to break it down kind of in an easy way. And so that's really how I got interested in apologetics. And eventually that started making my blog grow even more because I think it really resonated with people that, yeah, I have heard some stuff like this and I wouldn't know how to respond. And yes, my kids need this. And so a lot more people started following my blog, and that led to me eventually writing the books. So it's been an interesting journey because, like I said, I certainly didn't set out trying to do this. When I started my blog, I didn't even know what the word apologetics was.
Yeah.
But today it's a passion.
That's awesome. And your latest book, the one that I want to talk about today that just came out, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, you unpack, obviously, really specific apologetics questions regarding Jesus. And I know you've written a couple other books really about the questions about God and other things. But when we're talking about Jesus, for the sake of my listening community, let me just give you some scoop. So she breaks down the book in 5 different sections. Number 1 are questions about the identity of Jesus, then the teachings of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and the difference Jesus makes. I have to say, first of all, the first 4 totally make sense, but I love that you added that final section about the difference that Jesus makes, because that, oh man, that just like puts a bow on it for me. I was excited about that.
Yeah, I think it's so important because those first 4 sections really hone in on, how do we know this is true and how do we understand it accurately, because it's not just, there's a lot of theology in the book, because it's not just, making the case for, Jesus being who he is, but how do we accurately understand that according to the Bible? So it's both the apologetics theology in those first 4 sections, but then we have to ask the question, okay, well, if Christianity is true, then what? Yeah. What do we do? What do we do now? We're in this great position where we know that this wonderful truth that's proclaimed in the Bible is really what it seems to be. But then what does that mean for our everyday lives? lives. And I feel like growing up, that was a piece that I missed. Growing up, even in a Christian family and in church all my life, is that I always believed Christianity was true, but I didn't really understand how that would transform everything I see in life.
Yes.
And that's so much of a passion for me now, just from a worldview perspective. In other words, if we know Christianity is true, we're going to put on some different glasses that we're seeing the world through, and it's going to change everything.
Yeah.
And I think that when I was growing up, it was more, and even as an adult, it was more like, okay, yeah, I believe in Jesus and someone else doesn't believe in Jesus, but we're basically the same. Well, we are all made in the image of God and we're all humans. We have that shared humanity, but we're going to see life very, very differently every step of the way. Yeah. And so that's what I hope to communicate in that last section, and to help parents and others who are spiritual influencers in the lives of kids to just communicate that truth of this is the difference it makes. This is why it matters.
Totally. Hey guys, I just want to say a quick thank you to all of you in the Graceologie community who have rated this show on iTunes or who have written a short review. It makes such a big difference. So if you happen to be listening and you've not yet done it, I would really appreciate it if you would. Would you click your podcast app or go visit iTunes and give us a 5-star rating or just a quick 1-sentence review? From my heart, it would really mean a lot. And I love that you brought up the point that you were actually raised in church, and yet there were a million questions from the apologetics perspective and the defense of faith that you would not have been prepared to answer as an adult, even as a Christian believer. So let's talk about that, because in your book, you actually answer and address lots of questions that you would not normally learn about in Sunday school or at church. So why did you add these in, and why did you think that's important?
Right. Well, there's actually a lot of research that's been done today, and probably a lot of people listening have heard bits and pieces of this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, the researchers have found over the last 10 plus years that at least 60% of kids are walking away from their faith by their early 20s today. And this has been confirmed by multiple independent research organizations. So it's not like one of those, one-off alarmist studies that we hear so much about, but this has been something that researchers all agree on, that kids are walking away from faith in droves today. And the question is really not if, it's how big of a factor is that. Is it more like 60% or is it more like 90%? So that's the scale that we're talking about. And so we definitely have sort of a crisis within the church of kids walking away. Yeah. But what's important is that the researchers don't just stop there and kind of drop us off and say, man, we've got a problem. We're going to take off after this. They actually look into the reasons for it. And so they dig in and they look to see, well, why are kids walking away from faith? And what they found overwhelmingly is that there are a lot of intellectual challenges that kids have encountered to faith, and they're not finding satisfactory answers. And so they haven't been engaging with all these kinds of questions. And we have a pretty good idea of what those questions are, what a lot of the challenges are, about how kids think that Christianity is anti-science, for example, or that Christianity is too judgmental and God wouldn't be like that, or they can't work out how hell could make theological sense. So there are a lot of these questions, and they have been kind of brought to the surface by research. And so it's interesting because, coming back to your question, when you look at what kids are learning in church, a lot of times there's very little connection with what we're seeing when kids walk away. So it's like there are two different conversations happening in the world. You have a very busy, noisy, secular world that's drowning out the voice of the church in a lot of ways, because they're making these claims about Christianity not being true and not being desirable. And meanwhile, in church, we just keep coming back to, let me tell you another story from the Bible, without ever talking about why we should believe that's true and why it matters. So it is like there are two different conversations going on. And this is, I don't mean to make a sweeping generalization, because surely there are some churches who are taking all this to heart and are working really hard to equip kids. But those churches would be the exception. perception in my experience. So when you look at a book like mine, talking to kids about Jesus, it sounds like it could be about anything really, right? That's a pretty broad topic. But when you open up the book, you're going to see questions that a lot of kids will never encounter in church. And that's because I write with a specific focus on the questions that parents need to talk about with their kids, given the challenges of today's secular world. Yes. So it's very specifically in that realm. And a lot of them kids won't hear about in church, but I think parents need to know that church isn't necessarily broadly addressing these kinds of things. And ultimately, it's our role as the parent to be the primary discipler in their lives and to understand these are the challenges that are out there. I'm the one who needs to prepare my kids, and I need to get equipped with an understanding of what that's going to look like.
Absolutely. And I think that even, for those listeners who maybe their season of parenting has already passed, or maybe they're a grandparent, or maybe they don't have children and they just have an influence of others in their lives. The thing that I really took away from your book is that it's actually good for all of us because it brings important questions to the surface of your heart. You walk us through it with the word and even, research like you just mentioned and historical documents that really authenticate our faith. And so I appreciate the fact that this is purposed to be a tool for parents to come alongside of their children, but it can be for anybody in terms of just being useful to facilitate meaningful conversations about the authenticity of Jesus. Now, when you're talking about such a big thing like apologetics, that's a scary word for a lot of people. It's overwhelming to so many, especially moms who would say, I wouldn't know the first thing about how to lead a discussion or something. So how do you address the overwhelm factor and to the woman or to the mom who would feel unequipped to even approach these conversations? And I guess I would like to lead you specifically to the way you start off the book about, low grade tidying and about tidy people and what you found out about that, because I thought that was the perfect way to eat the elephant, if you would, the whole one spoonful at a time thing. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think so. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever got in the writing process was from my very first editor on my first book. He said, don't write your introduction until you're done writing the book. Now, that's really hard for someone like me because I am a super A to B kind of person. We're going to start at the beginning. We're going to work our way through. So that was hard for me. But he was so right, because when you get to the end of the book, then you can ask yourself the question, okay, after all this, what do I most want the reader to know before they even get started? Yeah. And after I had finished writing this book and I asked myself that question, I just thought, there are so many parents or grandparents or others who will be overwhelmed by just the thought that they would have to learn all of these things. And no matter how easy I try to make it and how much I try to break it down, it can be challenging. And sometimes we're just, we've got so much on our plates and so much going on in our lives that it's hard to just sit down and really work through something like this. And so when I wrote the introduction, I really wanted to encourage people to think of these conversations in a way that is not overwhelming and that they become part of your ongoing day-to-day lifestyle. So the analogy that I give when you mentioned the low grade tidying was from this article that I came across on Facebook one day. And just as a little background context here, I really have trouble keeping my house clean. I don't know if anyone can relate to that. Maybe.
I think that's a good deal of us, girl.
and not so much even like the dusting kind of stuff, but I mean picking up. There are papers everywhere. The kids leave their stuff everywhere. I found a lot of solutions with my kids so far in their young lives, but I cannot find a solution for getting my kids to pick up after themselves. So please reach out via email if anyone can help me at that. But I came across this article and it was called 5 Things That Tidy People Don't Do. And I thought, okay, this is something I really need to know about. So I click on the article and it was totally one of those clickbait things. But at the same time, it gave me this mind-blowing insight for me personally when it comes to cleaning up, but also an analogy for faith. And here's one of the points that it said that resonated so strongly. It said, tidy people don't act like a slob all day and then try to clean everything up in one fell swoop. That's too overwhelming. Instead, they develop these tiny, non-drastic kinds of habits so that they're always in a state of low-grade tidying.
Yeah.
That has stuck with me ever since. And it had to become part of the introduction, because I think that is how we start to have a different mindset about having faith conversations in our home. It's not like you pick up a book like mine and say, okay, it's time for a family retreat. We're going away to the mountains for 2 weeks and we're going to sit down and actually figure out why we're Christians and why there's good reason to believe this is true. I think that's how parents feel, because it can seem overwhelming. But the idea that I want people to kind of come away with is that this is about an ongoing lifestyle. This is about how we have conversations in our daily life. This is about how we weave these things in so that it is part of our whole worldview, how we see everything, and we're consistently bringing these things up. And I know sometimes parents feel like, gosh, I don't know how I can even bring these things up. But whenever I talk to parents, the parents who have actually read some books or listened to some podcasts, watched some videos, they don't really have that question so much, because they start to see those opportunities. So I want to encourage parents to know that this can become an ongoing way of life for you. You can do the low grade, ongoing tidying of your kids' understanding of Jesus once you start to just take the time to equip yourself with that understanding. And then you start to see the opportunities everywhere. And it's interesting, because it's almost like you get this little worldview radar that goes up on your head, where now you just saw somebody in a TV show say something, and it's a perfect opportunity to, say, like, is that consistent with the Christian worldview, or is that not? And have those kinds of conversations. So, I think it just helps for parents to understand. It doesn't mean that, you're going to have to do this deep clean on your kids' understanding of Jesus all in a day or in a week-long retreat to the mountains. This is about transforming your whole way of discipleship in your home or with your grandchildren, when you have those opportunities to have little conversations, whatever the case may be. And I appreciate what you said about how this can be valuable for other people, even if you don't have kids. And I've actually heard that quite a bit from people who said, maybe you should just, retitle the book and publish it again for other people so they know to pick it up, because a lot of times people do get so overwhelmed, and hopefully this helps. And I just want to say too, that at the end of every chapter, there's a conversation guide. So I wanted to help parents with that too, because sometimes parents feel like, oh my gosh, I just got this all in my head and now I need to get it out into conversation. And how do I do that? And so every single chapter has a step-by-step conversation, a guide at the end to help parents to kind of ask some of those questions and get the conversations flowing.
Yeah. And not only does the end of each chapter have the conversation guide, which is actually broken into 3 sections. You are so good at summarizing. It also has key points from the chapters. I'm like, oh, I love this woman. She gives me, because most of us growing up, we wanted the cliff notes, and you give it to us at the end of each chapter. You're like, okay,
what's so funny about that though? The editor of my second book, she hadn't worked with me before, and I guess she wasn't very, familiar with apologetics and stuff like that. And she actually asked me after she started editing, she's like, your chapters are so short. They're only like 4 or 5 pages, and then you have key points. I've never seen a book that needs key points after 4 or 5 pages. Are you sure you want to do that? People always tell me they appreciate the key points because it's just easy to come back to. So
1,000%. 1,000%
pages, and then you get your key points, and then you have your conversation starters. It's like, here's your toolbox.
It is a toolbox of all toolbox. And I have to say, it really is. And when you're talking about low grade tidying, I was like, when I read that, I'm like, oh my goodness. Okay, that makes so much sense. But then it totally applies. It applies. But it also reminded me, even while you were talking, and I looked this up, it reminded me of what the Lord said in Deuteronomy 6. So I'm going to read to you Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, for the sake of my listeners, because even as Natasha was explaining how our influence in these conversations should be taking place all the time, day in and day out, that's actually instruction from the Word of God. It says in Deuteronomy 6, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments I give to you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your house and on your gates. If that's not the perfect picture of that low-grade tidying method of cleaning your house all day long, or the faith translation of let this be constantly in your dialogue as parents. See, that's street level. That's something that we can take away, as moms and as influencers of children, is to not wait for Sunday school or the drive to church or from church. Those are great times to have conversations with your kids, but the mandate from the Lord is, listen, I'm to be your obsession, essentially. Love me with everything you have and talk about me all the time. And so anyway, that was a really profound reminder of the importance of these conversations. And so, I was grateful for that reference, but I also had a personal takeaway on the tidy thing. So that was helpful too.
Yeah, and I love that. It really is Deuteronomy 6. And as you are reading that, and it's funny because in my presentations, when I do give talks, we talk about Deuteronomy 6, but I didn't explicitly tie that into the introduction. As you were reading it, I was just thinking, how did I not do that so explicitly at that point in time? Because you're right. It's the biblical picture of the low grade tidying. Yeah. And it's so true, where we are to talk about God at all times. So I love that.
Yeah. So you mentioned in the first section of the book that parents, we often talk about the focus of the teachings of Jesus rather than on his identity. But you have that whole first section is on the identity of Jesus. So why does that matter? Why is that an important conversation for us to be having with our kids versus the teachings of Jesus? Why did you think this was such an important way to start?
Well, both are very important. And
Sure.
I do have a whole section there on the teachings, but I think we often forget about talking with our kids regarding the whole identity question. And how do we actually know that Jesus was who he said he was, that he was actually God himself? And I think that that's kind of a natural outcome of parenting, just because when we're going about our day-to-day life, if we are not being super intentional to talk about things like the identity of Jesus, it's much easier to just bring up naturally in the flow of things what Jesus taught, because, if there's something behaviorally that comes up, here's what Jesus would have said, or here's what Jesus would have done. And it just kind of ties more naturally into our lives, as opposed to, hey, pass the butter, let's talk about whether or not Jesus was the Son of God. So I think that for a lot of parents, it's just not quite as natural to talk about that. But here's why it's so important to start with the identity of Jesus. If we can't establish and help our kids to understand why there's good reason to believe Jesus was God, his teachings actually don't matter at all. He just becomes another person in history. And at that point, what he has to say about our lives, if he is not truly God, it has no more bearing on our lives than what our next door neighbor would have to say. And I think that's so important. And it's a stark contrast. And it's one that our kids need to understand so that they know why this is such an important question. Otherwise, we're just talking about Jesus being a good moral teacher. And some people believe today that Jesus was just a good moral teacher, and we'll take his what he taught about love, and yes, we like to love others, and Jesus seemed like a pretty nice, good person, and sometimes that's how people take him to be today. But he was so much more, according to the Bible, both in what people claimed about him and about what he claimed for himself. And so understanding those questions, the book has questions like, is Jesus a myth? Some people don't believe he even existed. Is Jesus the Jewish Messiah? What does that have to do with this whole picture? How did the Old Testament point to the New Testament, and what implication does that have for his divinity? Did he claim to be God? And what did other people claim about him? And how should we believe these accounts about the miracles? These are all the kinds of things that I cover in that first section. And it gives kids and adults a foundation for just understanding, here's why the teachings matter. Here's why everything else matters. It's because Jesus was God. He actually was God in the flesh. And when we can grasp that, when our kids grasp that, everything else matters so much more. So that's why I start the book in that way with the identity, because it's the establishment of who he was that makes everything else be of utmost importance, whether we're talking about his teachings or his death or considering the evidence for the resurrection and ultimately the difference that he makes.
Yeah, those are huge. These are huge. Now, even as you were speaking about this, I was reminded about my community, my Graceologie girls. I get emails and direct messages on Instagram from them all the time. I'm hearing constantly feedback. And I know that there's a lot of my listeners who are wrestling with some of these questions themselves. Some of them have non-believing spouses. Some of them are just overwhelmed with the brokenness in their own lives, with their disappointments and disillusionments about, the circumstances of their world right now, and they're struggling with faith on their own. What would you say to those moms, to those who are just trying to figure it all out for themselves? And are these conversations good for them to be having? Where would this book, the content of what you've written, meet them, even in the midst of their own questions and grapplings?
Right. Well, for the first thing I would say is that it's okay. It is okay to struggle with doubt. And I think it is completely natural and normal. And if it helps anyone to hear this, even as an apologist who has studied all this evidence and I've written these books and I speak about these things, there are times that I'll go through doubt. And I think that a lot of people who are known for writing books and speaking would say the same thing. And they've written books about that as well. But I think that this is the nature of being a human, first of all. And I think that we have to be honest about that we don't know really anything around us with absolute certainty if we're looking for that 100% mathematical kind of certainty. And, I always give my daughter the example, like, you can't know if, this is all a dream. If you want to talk about all the vast possibilities in the universe about reality, you could say, oh, well, I guess it's possible that all of this could be a dream. And we can kind of get caught up in all of those possibilities. But what I like to impress upon my kids, and what I would impress upon anyone who's struggling, is that if a person is really honest with themselves, no matter what your worldview is, whether you're an atheist or you're a Christian or you're a Mormon, whatever the case is, I think you're always going to have room for doubt. There's always going to be that. If you're an atheist, you should have your doubts at times about what you believe, because there's a lot of evidence that there's an intelligence behind the universe. And so how you weigh the evidence that you see, of course, is going to be different for every person. But an honest atheist should have doubts. And an honest Christian, I don't want to say should, because we have the witness of the Holy Spirit, but I want to say that it's natural and normal for every human to have those doubts. And it's not just something with Christianity. I think a lot of times Christians need to hear that, because sometimes they think, well, why are Christians doubting so much? Why do you hear so much about Christians walking away? Well, atheists doubt too, and they should doubt as well. So I don't know. I hope that's helpful for some people to hear in terms of what do I do with that. But I also think that we don't want to stay in our doubts, right? We don't want to be there forever. We need to accept that, okay, it's okay, I'm doubting, and Jesus wants us to pursue him, and he wants to give us answers to our doubts. So being honest about where we are and praying about it, and also taking steps to figure out, okay, well, what are some answers? And so a lot of people have kind of proposed that there are different kinds of doubts, and I think that can be helpful for thinking about it. Sometimes we have doubts because of something emotional for us. Maybe we've lost a family member after healing and God didn't answer that prayer, and we start to doubt God because of that. It's not so much that we're doubting all of these intellectual claims about the truth of Christianity, but that we're feeling hurt and we're grappling with that emotion. That's one kind of doubt. And I think that, honestly, no matter how much you read about the facts, a lot of times you'll still feel the doubt because it's an emotional kind in that case. And I think in a case case like that, I would suggest to someone to read something more from a pastoral perspective, something that maybe a pastor has written about dealing with grief and where is God when it hurts, those kinds of things. But if someone is struggling more with, how do I actually know this is true? Like, how do I know God actually exists, even though I can't see him? Maybe I'm not feeling him lately. So it's kind of bringing up these questions. From that perspective, I absolutely think that a book like mine would be helpful, because it will lay that basic foundation for you of saying, okay, let's get back to the basics here. And maybe they're not so basic after all. Maybe they're things that should be properly basic for people, but haven't necessarily been because they haven't learned about them in church. And so I hope it will bring people back to a foundation of saying, let's start from the beginning. Chapter number 1, is Jesus a myth? Okay. Yeah. We're going to the very beginning. How do we know he existed? And it will just walk you through that, from that to the important teachings of Jesus that people often misunderstand today, and then into why the death of Jesus matters and what was the meaning and how did this relate to the whole Old Testament and sacrifices and all these things that seem kind of crazy to us today, and into the resurrection. Ultimately, the truth test of our faith, Paul says, is the resurrection. He says that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain. So if you are doubting intellectually Christianity, it starts right there. Paul tells us it starts right there. If he hasn't been raised, it's done. We shouldn't care about anything else with Christianity. Jesus wasn't who he said he was. He said he would come back to life. So this was the ultimate validation of his claims of divinity. So if Christ has been raised, then everything he said it was true. He is the authority of our lives, our creator and sustainer, and everything changes from there. So the historical evidence for the resurrection can be really helpful also for people struggling with this. And I cover that in the book as well. So that was a really long answer to that question, but I think it's a complex question. It's something a lot of people struggle with. Yeah. I get emails from lots and lots of parents with unbelieving spouses who are losing their faith. And I have heard from many people that the book has been helpful for them, and other books have been helpful for them in having those conversations.
Yeah, no, and I agree. It is a conversation we need to be having. And I think that we need to allow that space in our hearts and in our minds to wonder. And we see such a beautiful picture of that in the Psalms. And David, my word, he asked God a lot of questions, and he struggled with darkness and doubt. And so if you're listening and this whole conversation just kind of, is overwhelming to you, you're like, I don't know the answers, then just know you're in good company. But God is the answer. And when we call out to him and when we seek his heart, he meets us there. I always say he's not a God who plays hide and seek. He reveals in his word. In Jeremiah, he talked to a very discouraged, weary prophet who was very frustrated and overwhelmed with life. And the Lord said to him, when you seek me, you will find me, when you search for me with all your heart. So, I guess that's a real practical takeaway, no matter where you are in all of this today, is the Lord tells us if we seek him, we will find him. So be a seeker of Jesus. So, Natasha, I'm just wondering, in a book like this, I know that there was a ton of research that would have gone into play on your end. In all of that, I would love to find out what surprised you or challenged you most when you were approaching this topic.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, every chapter, there are 30 topics. And so there's so much that gets covered in there. And there's always, some when you're researching, and you're right, a lot of research goes into a book like this. And when you're researching, you always learn new things. But I think that for me, writing about is Jesus the Jewish Messiah, that the complexity of this subject, it was one of the subjects that I'd say personally I had read the least about before writing the book. And I read hundreds and hundreds of pages in order to write my little, whatever 5-page chapter it is. And it was surprising to me just how complex the topic is in terms of, scholarly disagreement about, which prophecies in the Old Testament were actually prophecies, and how do you count a prophecy, and how did people think of the Messiah? What were they expecting at the time of Jesus? There were so many different expectations when Jesus came along, which a lot of times people think, well, how come everyone, we look at all these nice little charts today about the Messiah and the prophecies and how only Jesus could have fulfilled them. Why didn't the Jewish people get it? But when you look at the history there and you understand how there were some different types of expectations and they looked very different for who this Messiah would be at the time, you start to have, I think, more empathy for the people at the time who were asking the questions, well, who is this? And, is this the Messiah? Because some people thought he was going to be this, royal conqueror and become a political earthly king. And others thought of it more in terms of, an eternal king. And so there were so many different thoughts going on. And so it was surprising to me, just the complexity. And it was also probably most difficult to write that chapter for the same reason, because once you get into that, then you get back to sitting in front of your Word document and there's your blank page. And it's like, okay, now I'm going to summarize that into 5 pages plus key points and a conversation guide.
That topic is normally approached on Palm Sunday when we're saying, okay, they were expecting him to be this. And it's like, it's a 5-minute conversation to something that could take 5 years to unpack on who is Jesus? Is he the Hebrew Messiah? So I can totally imagine that. So that's amazing. Well, I loved having this conversation with you today. And I would just wonder, Natasha, if you would mind right now taking all of us just to the feet of our Messiah right now in prayer.
Absolutely. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this time together, just talking about these eternally important truths and all of the responsibilities that we have as parents and grandparents and aunts and cousins, and all of us have the opportunity to impact the next generation and to really just influence kids around us. And I just pray that this conversation would open eyes to those opportunities, whether that's right in our own house or whether that's in our church, wherever it might be for the people listening. I pray that you would just put someone on their heart that they can be the bearer of truth, that they can be bringing these truths to that person. And Lord, I know that this is overwhelming for a lot of people. I know that sometimes when we hear about these things, we're thinking about all of the burdens in our lives and all of the things that can weigh on us so strongly. And it's easy to just kind of walk away and say, okay, that's just too much to deal with. But Lord, this is so important today. The world is getting so challenging for the next generation, and they need to know these truths. They need to know why they can lean on you and why they can put their trust 100% on you, and why it's worth standing strong in their faith in you and not walking away even when it seems so hard. So Lord, I ask that for each person listening, that you would give them one thing, that there's just one thing that they can take away and go to that next step and say, okay, I'm going to do this. Please just put that on their hearts as to what you would have for them to do. And for those who are struggling with doubt that we talked about, I pray that you would convict them of your presence and that you would draw them near and that you would help them to see that you are waiting with your arms open, and that whatever it is that is their barrier, whether it's emotional or intellectual, whatever that is, I just pray that you would remove it and that you would help them to come close to you and to just know that you are there. You are their Father. You are their God. Lord, we thank you for this time together. In your name, amen.
Amen. The book is Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. And my guest has been Natasha Crain. Natasha, it has been so good to hang out with you today and talk about such an important subject. Where is the best place online where my listeners can connect with you?
Well, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been so great talking with you, too. I really enjoyed it. My website is Natasha Crain, and my last name is Crain, not Crane like the bird. Forever clarifying that, natashacrain.com. And there you can see my blog and find out more about my books.
Perfect. And I'll have links to all of those things on the show notes as well. So you can go to gwensmith.net/Graceologie, find my episode with Natasha Crain, and have all the things. But Natasha, it has been awesome to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining me.
And thank you so much.
Man, guys, these are such important topics for us to cover, right? Be sure to visit Natasha online and connect with her on social media as well. Today's show is edited by Chad Shooping, and the music is by premiumbeat.com. Hey, if your church hosts women's events, or if you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, once again, I love hearing from you. So send me a message directly from my website, which is at gwensmith.net. All of the links and the show notes from today's episode can be found at gwensmith.net/Graceologie. That's gwensmith.net/Graceologie. Thanks again for joining me today. I will definitely be back soon with another episode. But until then, if you have not yet subscribed to the Graceologie podcast, would you open up your podcast app right now and click that subscribe button? Subscriptions, ratings, and reviews on Apple Podcast or whatever podcast app you listen to make a huge difference to those of us who are working hard to bring you these shows. And definitely connect with me on social media as well. I'm at Gwen Smith Music on every platform, and especially love hanging out on Instagram, so I hope to see you there. And this show is at Graceologie with an IE on every platform as well. Now get out there and have a beautiful, grace-filled day.